Okay, so we're picking up with chapter 12, which is going to be looking at the politics of the Roaring Twenties. So we're in the post-World War I era in America, and what we're going to see are three basic trends in American society. And really it all boils down to that there is this desire to return back to normal, to normalcy, and that's going to be something that you hear a lot. So these three trends include isolationism, which is where we're not going to be concerned with the rest of the world. We're going to be concerned with just ourselves, which is how we were normally before World War I. We also are going to have a second trend of nativism. And nativism is like anti-immigrant, anti-foreign, trying to get rid of those outside influences. And then the third is political conservatism, and basically meaning that government needs to cut back and government needs to be less involved in people's lives. So those are going to be the three trends that we see develop in American society after World War I. Now, there is a new concern for us on the forefront, and that is communism. And communism came about because of the Russian Revolution. Remember, the Russians dropped out of World War I because they were having issues in their own country. And the Russian Revolution was led by the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin. And they seize power in Russia, and they get rid of the Tsar, they get rid of the king in Russia. And they install this new government called communism. The problem is that as Americans, we really don't know too much about it. And if it's something that we don't know about, it tends to freak us out. That's just how we operate. That's how we work. And so this Russian Revolution, or this idea of communism in Russia, is going to lead to the first Red Scare in the United States. And it's called the first Red Scare because there's going to be a second one. And it's called a Red Scare because that's the color of communism. That's the color of the Russian flag. It is their symbol. Well, the reason that this scare comes into the United States is because communism and governments that topple to communism aren't taken over by another country. It's not like they come in and force you to be communist. Instead, communism spreads internally, which means that it starts with your own people. And that's going to freak Americans out because after World War I, or as we look back on World War I, we could see some communist tendencies in the United States. For example, the War Industries Board. Remember, that was created by Wilson in order to get our economy ready for World War I, and to make sure that we had enough uniforms and enough weapons and all that stuff. And so the government's going to regulate, this is how much you have to produce, and this is what you can pay for it, and this is how much you have to pay your workers, and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's very, very communist in its idea, in its format. Plus, there was a Communist Party in the United States. It had already formed. It had an estimated 70,000 members, which isn't a lot. It's not like predominant or anything, but just the fact that we had a Communist Party was kind of scary, because remember, communism starts internally. It starts within the people themselves, and then it overtakes the government. And so the fact that it even exists in the United States was somewhat of a scare. Well, what is communism? We know today that the communist beliefs include things like abolishing private property, that the government owns factories and railroads and other businesses in order to control costs, but it also limits your choices. And what it does essentially is it takes away competition. And when you have less competition, prices are going to be set by what the people who are in charge say they're going to be set. So there's no competition to have lower prices. So it flies basically in the face of our economic belief, which is capitalism, which means that you compete and you're able to choose whatever job you want, and you're able to have choices about products. And if you don't like one company, you can go find another company. So it kind of goes against our beliefs of capitalism and free enterprise, that you get choices that you can make, and you can go from rags to riches and all that kind of stuff. So this first Red Scare is actually going to start off basically persecution of communists in the United States. The Attorney General at this time, who was A. Mitchell Palmer, is going to appoint J. Edgar Hoover to an agency that will eventually become the FBI. But his job in this agency is to root out communists and to make sure that they're not planning to overthrow the government. And so these government agents are called out to hunt down suspected communists and socialists and anarchists. And anarchists are people who want to overthrow the government. And eventually they're going to be called the Palmer Raids because A. Mitchell Palmer was in charge of them. So that's what they're going to be called. But in these Palmer raids, people's civil rights are going to be ignored. There's invasion of private homes, going into meeting halls and into offices looking for evidence of them overthrowing the government. The suspects are going to be jailed for weeks at a time, and anyone who visits them is going to be arrested as well because they're in cahoots together kind of thing. Some immigrants will actually be deported without a trial. If you go through the deportation system, you're supposed to have a trial and show that you are a danger to the United States. But that step gets conveniently overlooked and ignored during the Palmer raids. So even though they were doing all of this stuff, they were violating people's rights left and right. These raids still failed to turn up any evidence of a conspiracy that the communists were trying to overthrow the U.S. government. It just wasn't there. Like I said, it's not a very large party at the time, so it's not like they had great organization or anything. It was just a different belief, which in the United States, you're entitled to a different belief. You don't have to believe in democracy, and you don't have to believe in the Democrats and Republicans. You have that ability to not believe in the form of government and to want to change it. That's part of our freedom here in the United States. Well, eventually what's going to happen is that it's going to affect even the judicial system and how people are treated in the judicial system. And we get the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco was a shoemaker and Bartolomeo Vanzetti was a fish peddler. And both of them are Italian immigrants to the United States. So they're not native born to the U.S. They're from Italy. And they had both evaded the draft in World War I. They had found ways to get out of it. And they were both also anarchists, meaning that they didn't like our form of government and wanted to change it. Well, eventually a crime is going to take place. In Massachusetts, 2 people were shot and killed. About $15,000 is taken, which at that time is a lot of money. And the witness to the crime said that the perpetrators looked Italian. Well, Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be arrested for this crime because they're Italian and they're anti-government, and they were kind of already on the police watch list sort of thing because of the Palmer raids. And so they're arrested and they will be put on trial, and they actually will be convicted of murder, but it's based on very circumstantial and very contradictory evidence. There's no real proof that they did it. There's no concrete proof. And when there's not concrete proof, you are supposed to be found innocent because there's probable cause that you didn't do it. You know, that there's this idea that you could maybe be innocent. You know, we're innocent until proven guilty. But the judge in the case was also very prejudiced, didn't like Italians, didn't like immigrants to begin with, and felt that the evidence was there. And so both men are going to be sentenced to death by the electric chair. The truth actually behind this case doesn't come out until 1961. Evidence is going to show that the gun that was found on Sacco at the time of his arrest was the weapon that was used to shoot the guard and kill him, but that's because we had forensic evidence at that time in 1961 that was not available in the 1920s. And so it just goes to show, yes, they were probably guilty, they probably did do the crime, but the problem is that they were convicted not because of the evidence showing them that they did they committed the crime, but their conviction and execution came about because of their political associations, not because they were proven guilty. And so it shows kind of a lack of due process in the judicial system at the time. But like I said, we're going to see a rise in nativism, and part of that rise in nativism comes from the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. The KKK is a very nativist group. It's an organization that is based on anti-immigrant, anti-foreign beliefs, and they kind of capitalize on that. I like to call them equal opportunity haters because they pretty much hate everybody. They hate blacks, they hate Catholics, they hate Jews, they hate immigrants, they hate unions. They pretty much hate everybody unless you are, white male, native-born Gentiles, roughly. They're fairly inactive throughout the 1870s, right after the Civil War, but they see a big revival in the 1920s. And by the 1920s, their membership is going to number somewhere around 4.5 million people, but they are, and still known for today, their racial violence that they commit against people. And they were doing this in the 1920s too, just maybe with a little less media focus than today. But a good example of what they were doing, and not only against blacks, but there's a case of Leo Frank. And Leo Frank was a Jewish man who was in jail. He was being held until his trial. And the KKK was convinced that he was not going to be convicted of this crime, that he was going to be able to get out. Remember, he had not had a trial yet, so they don't know which way it would have gone. So the KKK is going to send in a vigilante mob and string him up outside the courthouse. So that was a way of showing their dominance and that they knew better than the court system of who's guilty and who's not. Another major thing that's going to be happening during the 1920s are the labor unions are going to get into issues with companies. In 1919 alone, so just in 1 year, there's going to be over 3,000 strikes in the U.S. About 4 million people are going to walk off the job, basically because they're not getting raises or that they are not allowed to even join a union to negotiate for their wages. 3 strikes are going to catch the public's attention. The first is going to be the Boston police strike. And the Boston police strike was, the Boston police force was upset. They hadn't seen a raise since before World War I, even though the cost of living had doubled. And the event that's going to take place around this is that representatives from the police union are going to go to the commissioner. And he fires these representatives. And the rest of the force said, wait a minute, so they go on strike. Well, the outcome is that the commissioner says, okay, all my policemen are no longer working, so he hires new men to take their place. And the original police were not allowed to return to their job, even if they got off the strike. They were basically fired. And the reason was because they had endangered the public safety. They had put people into a position of being in danger. So that's going to catch the public's attention because of how that all came out. The second one is the steel mill strike, and again, the issue is a living wage and that work conditions were difficult and dangerous. They also wanted a shorter workday because if you aren't exhausted, there might be less chance of having an accident. Well, what happens is that the corporation, the steel mill corporation, is going to refuse to even meet with the union representatives and just to even talk about things. And so 350,000 workers are going to walk off the job there. Well, the outcome of this is that the corporation, the steel mill, is going to hire strike breakers. And these are guys that come in and basically beat you until you go back to work. And they killed 18 workers who were on strike, and they wounded hundreds more. And they did break the strike, so I guess they accomplished their goal. But there's very little change for the workers. They don't get a chance to argue their point. The third one is the coal miners' strike. And the coal miners' strike, again, is low wages, long work days, all that kind of stuff. And the coal miners decide that they're going to send in their top guy. So John J. Lewis, who is the new president of the United Mine Workers, so he's the president of the mine company, and he decides to go to bat for the union. The outcome, however, is that neither one of them can get along. They're not getting anything accomplished, and so people are having a problem getting coal. So the major issue was that people were not getting coal, and winter was coming up, so they needed to get this figured out. And so President Wilson is going to appoint a judge to kind of be an arbitrator, which means that they're going to be kind of the middleman person. They listen to one side, then they listen to the other side, and then they decide what's best. And so he appoints this judge to decide on the issues between the unions and the owners. And what ends up happening is that they get a 20% increase in their wages, but they don't get a shorter workday. But at least they got something. And so it's kind of seen as this major victory for the unions. Lewis will become a national figure out of this, and he's kind of seen as the guy who brought it about and had this major victory and all that kind of stuff. But even though it was a victory for the coal miners, it wasn't for the Boston police, and it wasn't for the steel mill workers. And so the labor movement starts to lose its appeal to a lot of people. They see a decline in membership, and there's four main reasons for this. The first is that a lot of the immigrants who were coming in were willing to work in these poor conditions, because even though they were poor working conditions, they were still better than what they were having back home. So they were willing to work in poor conditions and not fight for anything better. The second reason is that because you have so many immigrants, you also have a lot of different languages that are going on, and it's very difficult to organize as a group because of that. The third is that because of the rise in technology of the industrial age, there's less need for farmers. And so a lot of farmers are coming to find jobs in the cities. And farmers are used to being pretty self-reliant. We're from Iowa. People think that we have this awesome, we have this reputation for having an awesome work ethic and that kind of thing. Well, that's the farming attitude. And that's going to transfer as they go into a factory, that they're pretty self-reliant. They just don't want to rely upon a union to make decisions for them. And then finally, the fourth reason is that most unions are going to exclude African Americans, who make up a pretty significant portion of the workforce in factories. There's a few unions that will accept them, like the mining industries, railroad porters, so guys who were carrying luggage and that kind of stuff, longshoremen, people who worked on the docks, that kind of thing. They will accept them in, but like the steel mill industry doesn't, the police industry, or the police force doesn't. So there's just a lot of unions that don't actually accept them in. The textile industry is another one. So that is going to cause some problems.